Imagine you are 17 years old. It is March 39 AD. You are standing in a corridor of the Palatine Palace, the seat of imperial power in Rome, and you have been told you were chosen. Not selected for marriage, not consulted about your future, chosen. The word should have meant honor. Instead, it means you will never leave this place the same. Your name is Livia. 3 days ago, you were bathing in your family's home on the Quirinal Hill when soldiers arrived without explanation. Your mother grabbed your hand. You remember the pressure of her fingers, desperate, terrified, as the guards separated you. She did not cry in front of them, but you heard her crying after they took you away. That sound is still in your ears. It will never leave. Now you stand before carved marble doors. Behind them, the man who rules the world is waiting. You know his name. Everyone knows his name. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though no one calls him that anymore. They call him Caligula. The name means little boot, a nickname from his childhood when he wore a soldier's uniform. That was when he was loved. That was before he understood what absolute power actually means. The guards do not speak to you. They do not look at you. This silence is its own kind of violence. You are not a person to them. You are an object that has been delivered. Your stomach tightens. You already know, on some level you cannot quite articulate, that the person you were 3 days ago no longer exists. That girl who debated philosophy with her tutor, who had a betrothed she had never met but might have grown to love, who slept in her own bed and woke to the sound of the city below. She is gone. The doors open inward. What you see confuses you. It is not a throne room. It is an apartment. Intimate, almost gentle. Silk cushions, oil lamps burning with scented oils. A man in his mid-20s stands by a window overlooking the city. He is thin. His face is handsome in a way that seems almost unfinished, as if the gods began sculpting him and then abandoned the work. He turns to you and smiles. This smile will destroy you more thoroughly than any cruelty could, because in this moment, you do not understand that kindness from this man is a weapon. You do not know that his gentleness is not mercy. It is the prelude to something far worse. You think, perhaps I will survive this. Perhaps I will be treated with respect. Perhaps I misunderstood what it means to be chosen by the emperor. In exactly 7 hours, you will understand that every kind assumption you made was a mistake. In exactly 3 weeks, you will no longer recognize yourself in the polished mirror of the palace. In exactly 4 months, you will wish that the soldiers had killed you on the Quirinal Hill instead of delivering you here. But right now, in this moment, he speaks your name, a name he should not know, that he should have no reason to know. And your heart fractures, because part of you believes that he knows it means he cares. That part of you will be used against you, again and again, until nothing remains but compliance. This is not a love story. This is not the fantasy of power that later emperors would create in their propaganda. This is what happens when one person holds absolute authority over another, when there are no witnesses who will testify, no laws that apply to the powerful, no escape. This is Caligula. And this is how the corruption of unlimited power destroys the mind more thoroughly than the body. What happened in the Palatine Palace during Caligula's reign was not madness. It was method. It was a system. And it was designed by a man who had learned that control, absolute, psychological, unrelenting, was more intoxicating than anything else the world could offer. And we know this happened. This is not fiction. This is not speculation written centuries later by moralists trying to teach a lesson. This is documented history, preserved in fragments by those who witnessed it or lived in its aftermath. The evidence comes from four critical sources. First, the writings of Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who visited Rome during Caligula's reign and recorded what he saw with precision and horror. His account describes not chaos, but systematic control. Second, Suetonius, who wrote his biography of Caligula nearly a century later, using court records and accounts from people who had served in the palace. These were not rumors, they were official documentation. Third, Cassius Dio, a Roman historian and senator who had access to imperial archives and legislative records. He wrote not about isolated incidents, but about patterns. Fourth, archaeological findings from the Palatine Palace itself. Inscriptions, architectural modifications, and structures that reveal how the emperor engineered his control. The fragmentary nature of these sources tells us something crucial. Historians of the ancient world were trained to be circumspect about what they wrote regarding imperial power. Speaking too directly about an emperor's crimes could mean death, not just for the historian, but for their family. So what survived in the historical record is often what could be said publicly. What truly horrified people often appears only in private letters or accounts written decades after the events, when those involved were already dead. The silence itself is evidence. When Suetonius describes what occurred in the palace, he uses clinical language. He kept women in the palace. He removed them when he tired of them. Witnesses were made to participate, precisely because direct language would have been too dangerous to preserve. But the restraint in the writing tells us the authors were documenting something so transgressive that even speaking plainly about it risked condemnation. We also know that Livia left no written record. The girls and women who experienced what happened in the Palatine Palace did not write memoirs or leave testimony, some because they could not read or write. Literacy was not universal among women of lower ranks. Some because survival meant silence. Some because what happened to them was so psychologically devastating that the mind refused to encode the memories in language. But their absence from the historical record is itself a kind of evidence. The system was designed to leave no witnesses, to erase identity, to make it impossible for victims to speak. What we are about to describe, the psychology of control, the engineering of dependency, the slow erasure of self, comes from piecing together the accounts that survived, the architecture that remains, and the historical pattern that repeats. Whenever absolute power is unchecked, these same mechanisms emerge. Caligula did not invent them, but he perfected them. And the evidence of that perfection is written into the very stones of the Palatine Palace, waiting for those willing to see it. To understand how this system became possible, we must first understand the man who built it. Caligula did not arrive at the throne intending to become a tyrant. He arrived at it believing he had been chosen by the gods, and for the first months of his reign, Rome celebrated. He distributed gifts to the people. He released political prisoners. He seemed, for a brief moment, to be the antidote to the paranoid cruelty of his predecessor, Tiberius. Rome exhaled. It was a mistake. In October of 37 AD, roughly a year before Livia was brought to the palace, Caligula became seriously ill. The fever lasted for weeks. Senators gathered to discuss who would succeed him. And then, as suddenly as it began, the illness broke. He recovered. But something vital did not return with him. Those who saw him emerge from his sickbed reported that he seemed different, harder. The gentleness that had drawn people to him had crystallized into something colder. One historian wrote that the man who left the sick room was not the man who had entered it. What had changed was his understanding of power. During those fevered weeks, while he lay helpless, Caligula had grasped something that would define his reign. He was mortal. The empire did not depend on his goodness or his intelligence. It depended on his existence. The moment he was gone, others would take what was his. The conspiracy to replace him, however brief, had revealed the truth. Power was not a gift from the gods. It was a game played by those strongest enough to keep it. And the only way to remain strongest was to make certain that no one could ever imagine replacing you. This is the moment the system began to form. Not from madness, but from calculation. He understood that absolute obedience required more than laws or threats. It required a complete reshaping of how people thought about power itself. It required making certain that those around him could not distinguish between safety and danger, between favor and punishment, between the possibility of mercy and the certainty of control. The architecture of the Palatine Palace was redesigned to serve this purpose. Caligula had private chambers connected by hidden corridors to the public spaces. He could move through the palace unseen, emerging suddenly, observing without being observed. Servants never knew if they were being watched. This uncertainty was not a side effect of the architecture. It was the entire point. The palace itself became an instrument of psychological control. He created a formal system of what we might call imperial favorites, young women selected from across the empire, ostensibly for the honor of serving the emperor. But serving meant something different from what the word implied. In the palace, a young woman named Suetonius met Caligula, and he decided she would be his wife. Then, almost as quickly, he decided she would share his attention with others. The honor of being chosen became indistinguishable from the trap of being owned. Consider the logic from the emperor's perspective. He had learned from Tiberius that absolute power could be taken away. The only solution was to make himself irreplaceable in the minds of those closest to him. If the women in his private chambers feared him, they might betray him. If they loved him, they might leave him. But if he could make them need him, if he could engineer emotional dependency so complete that they could not imagine existing outside his sphere, then they would never betray him. They would become his extensions, his proof of his dominance, his living validation that he could reshape human minds entirely. The legal framework supported this. Roman law granted the emperor extraordinary powers. He could override the decisions of magistrates. He could declare precedent meaningless. But more importantly, he had no accountability. There was no court that could try him, no assembly that could remove him, no authority greater than his own. The empire itself had built a system where one person could, if they were willing to do so, reshape reality according to their will. Caligula was the first emperor who truly understood the implications of that absolute absence of restraint. His court became complicit in the system. Guards, attendants, senators, and bureaucrats had to choose: participate in what was happening or be destroyed by it. Most chose participation. Watching became a form of collaboration. Witnessing the emperor's actions in private chambers and remaining silent meant accepting the validity of his power. It meant becoming responsible for maintaining the illusion that what he did was normal, acceptable, the natural order of an imperial household. By the time Livia arrived at the palace in 39 AD, the system had been perfected. It was not chaos. It was not the random cruelty of a madman. It was a carefully constructed apparatus of psychological manipulation, designed by a man who had learned that the human mind was more malleable than any law, and that the corruption of absolute power lay not in what you did, but in making your victims believe they deserved it. The first 3 days were deceptive. Caligula gave Livia fine clothes, not her own, but garments chosen for her, suggesting that her tastes no longer mattered. He gave her jewels. He called her beautiful. When she wept that first night, he held her, speaking softly about how fortunate she was, how many women would kill for her position. He did not explain what that position actually entailed. The ambiguity itself was part of the apparatus. She could tell herself that perhaps nothing terrible would happen. Perhaps the emperor simply enjoyed her company. Perhaps, and this was the cruelest thought of all, perhaps she might come to matter to him. Another girl arrived on the second day. Her name was Sylla. She was 14. Caligula introduced them as if they were friends, as if they would be companions in their good fortune. Livia felt something shift inside her, a moment of relief, actually, at not being alone. Sylla seemed terrified in a different way. She could not stop talking, filling the silence with nervous chatter about her family in Gaul, about how she had been selected from thousands of girls. Livia realized, with a clarity that made her stomach drop, that Sylla had not yet understood what this place was. She had not understood because Caligula had not yet shown her. By the end of the first week, Livia had learned the emperor's moods like a language. He was pleasant in the morning. During the afternoon, he could become irritable, sometimes over trivial things, sometimes with no apparent cause. By evening, he was often melancholic, speaking about betrayals from his family, about the burden of ruling alone, about how no one truly understood him. When he was like this, he required comfort. Livia began to anticipate his needs. She would prepare his favorite wine before he asked for it. She would sit quietly beside him, offering her presence as a kind of balm. She did not realize that she was training herself to become dependent on his moods, that she was learning to subordinate her own emotional state to his. Sylla did not adjust as quickly. On the third day, when Caligula demanded something of her and she hesitated, just for a moment, just from confusion, he turned cold. The warmth drained from his face. He left the chamber without speaking. For hours, Sylla did not know what she had done wrong. She wept. She apologized to Livia over and over for whatever invisible mistake she had made. That night, Caligula summoned only Livia. The message was clear. Compliance earned attention. Hesitation earned erasure. This became the pattern of existence. Weeks blurred into an endless cycle of small cruelties wrapped in gifts. A morning of tenderness followed by an afternoon of indifference. A promise of freedom, perhaps you will visit your family soon. Followed by a clarification that such things were impossible, that she had misunderstood. The emperor had simply been testing how much she wanted to see them. Did she want to leave the palace so badly that she would consider him insufficient? The question was rhetorical. The answer he wanted was already written into the architecture of the palace itself. By the fourth week, Livia and Sylla had stopped consoling each other. Instead, they competed. When Caligula favored one girl over the other, it created a hierarchy. Those who received his attention felt validated. Those who did not felt abandoned. Caligula never explicitly created this competition, but he understood its psychology perfectly. He would praise Livia in front of Sylla. Then, the next day, he would praise Sylla in front of Livia. He would give one girl a night alone with him, then ignore her for 3 days, turning his attention instead to the other. The girls began to resent each other. They began to whisper about what the other girl had done to displease him, as if there were some secret key to remaining in his favor. A third girl, Drusilla, arrived in the 5th week. She was older, nearly 20, and she had been brought to the palace from the imperial household itself. Her father had been an important senator. She understood, from the moment she arrived, what was happening. She did not try to find comfort in the system. Instead, she played it. She praised Caligula constantly. She performed devotion. She made herself useful by becoming his spy, reporting on what Livia and Sylla did in the hours he was not present. It was a calculated choice, and it worked. Drusilla received more gifts, more attention. She moved more freely through the palace. Livia watched this and felt something crystallize inside her. Resistance was futile. Honesty was dangerous. Survival meant becoming someone else. Someone who could betray, who could deceive, who could perform affection without feeling it. She began to imitate Drusilla, offering information she had overheard, exaggerating small conversations into perceived disloyalties. She did this not out of genuine malice toward Sylla, but because survival required it. The system had turned her into an instrument of her own complicity. Months erased distinctions that had once seemed crucial. Livia could no longer clearly remember what her life had been like before the palace. Her family seemed unreal, dreamlike, impossible. The palace had become the only reality that existed. She woke there. She slept there. Every thought was filtered through the question, "What does the emperor want?" Her name was still Livia, but the person who answered to that name bore no resemblance to the girl who had been taken from the Quirinal Hill. And yet, in the small hours of night, when she was alone in the chamber she shared with Sylla, Livia would sometimes refuse to move when Caligula called. Not as resistance, she did not have the courage for that, but as a small internal refusal. She would answer his summons, but there was something in her that did not comply. Some part of her that was still her, locked away, watching what she had become from a distance she could not quite explain. It was not defiance, it was not strength, it was simply the remnant of consciousness that no system, however perfected, could completely erase. This is the cruelty that cannot be measured in blood or bruises. This is the erosion of the self, the slow, systematic destruction of the person you were, replaced by a hollow shell that performs the function the emperor requires. By the end of 4 months, Livia had survived. But survival meant becoming unrecognizable to herself. By the 6th month of Livia's captivity, Caligula had refined the system to its essential form. It was not sufficient that the women submitted. It was not sufficient that they obeyed. What he required was something deeper. He needed to see, in their eyes, the moment they understood that they were no longer human beings, but objects, possessions, extensions of his will. And for that understanding to take root, there had to be witnesses. The ritual occurred on a Friday evening in late September. Caligula summoned Livia, Sylla, and Drusilla to the great hall of the palace. This alone was unusual. They had never been brought to the formal spaces together. As they entered, they saw that the hall had been prepared. Senators were present, high-ranking officials, palace staff, perhaps 50 people in total, standing along the walls, their faces carefully composed into expressions of neutrality. Livia understood immediately that she was not being brought here for privacy. She was being brought here for display. This was the architecture of the ritual. The emperor stood at the center, but he was not alone. He was witnessed. The presence of senators, of officials, of bureaucrats meant that what was about to occur was not a private act. It was a public statement about power. The witnesses had to watch. They had to see. And by seeing and remaining silent, they had to become complicit. They had to understand that they too had no choice. That they too served at the pleasure of a man for whom normal concepts of restraint held no meaning. Caligula began by speaking about loyalty. He spoke about how the empire was built on hierarchies of power, on each person serving those above them with complete submission. He spoke about how the women in his household were the most privileged in Rome, and yet they sometimes seemed to forget what privilege actually meant. Livia recognized this as the prelude to punishment. She had learned his rhythms. Kindness followed by explanation, then cruelty. He then ordered them to stand in a line. He walked slowly past each of them, examining them as if they were objects at a market. He stopped in front of Livia. He asked her a question, a simple one, asking her to confirm something she had said weeks earlier. But she could not remember what he was referring to. In the silence of her hesitation, she saw the moment of satisfaction cross his face. She had failed a test she did not know she was taking. He ordered her to her knees, not to harm her, but to humiliate her, in front of the senators, in front of the other girls, in front of the watching court. The point was not the act itself, but the presence of witnesses. She was being unmade publicly. Her dignity, whatever remained of it, was being stripped away in front of powerful men who would carry this image with them when they left the palace. She would become a symbol, a living reminder of what happened to those who belonged to the emperor. Scylla began to weep. Drusilla stared straight ahead, and Livia felt something inside her separate. Not break, but separate. She became observer of her own existence. She watched herself from outside her body as if the humiliation was happening to someone else. It was a survival mechanism, a dissociation so complete that the self retreated into an untouchable interior space. She no longer felt the weight of the emperor's judgment because there was no longer an I present to feel it. The ritual lasted perhaps 30 minutes. It ended not with mercy, but with Caligula dismissing them, as if they had been nothing more than scenery in a performance designed to entertain himself and cement the absolute nature of his power. As the women were led away, Livia noticed something that broke through her dissociation. Drusilla's hands were shaking. For the first time, Livia saw in her a recognition of their shared condition. That recognition, that moment of mutual understanding, was quickly suppressed. She could not afford to feel kinship with anyone. Kinship required humanity, and humanity was a luxury that no longer existed in the palace. But there was something else. As Livia was being led from the hall, she refused to lower her gaze. She looked directly at the senators watching her. She did not do this as defiance. She did not have the strength for that. She did this because in that moment she wanted them to see her, not as a symbol of imperial power, but as a person, as someone who was still present inside the shell that had been made to perform compliance. It was a futile gesture. They looked away. But she had made it anyway. This was the transformation Caligula required, not obedience born from fear, but obedience born from the complete erosion of the belief that there was an alternative. The ritual showed everyone, the victims, the witnesses, the empire itself, that resistance was impossible, that resistance was not even thinkable, that the only rational response was surrender. Caligula's reign lasted nearly 4 years. For nearly 4 years, the Palatine Palace operated as a closed system where normal rules did not apply. The women remained. Some died. Some were removed. Others arrived to replace them. The cycle continued because there existed no mechanism to stop it. Roman law, supposedly the cornerstone of civilization, was irrelevant. The emperor was the law. His actions could not be illegal because illegality required judgment by someone with authority over him. No such person existed. The senators who witnessed the rituals faced a choice: speak out and be executed, or remain silent and survive. They chose silence. This silence was not cowardice. It was rational self-preservation in a system designed to eliminate anyone who threatened the emperor's absolute authority. To speak was to die. So they spoke to no one. They carried their knowledge back to the Senate and kept it locked away. The empire knew, in the way empires always know, but knowing was not the same as acknowledging. In January of 41 AD, roughly 1 year after Livia's arrival, the system finally broke. Not because of justice, but because Caligula's unpredictability had become a threat to those closest to him. Members of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own security detail, decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. They murdered him in a theater. It was not an act of moral reckoning. It was an act of self-preservation by men who had recognized that their own lives were at risk. What happened to Livia after is what the historical record does not adequately explain. She was alive at the time of Caligula's death. She was 19 or nearly 20 years old, depending on the exact dates. But there is almost no written record of what became of her or the other women. They were not celebrated as survivors. They were not given compensation. They were given, it seems, silence. Money was distributed to those who had suffered under the emperor, but this was framed as clemency from the new regime, not justice for victims. The women were hidden, absorbed back into whatever families would take them, or left to survive as best they could. The system that had created Caligula survived his death intact. The laws that had granted absolute power to the emperor remained in place. The architecture of the palace remained. Future emperors would use the same mechanisms, the same psychological manipulation, the same techniques of erosion and control. Because the empire had not destroyed the system, it had only destroyed the man. And a new man, given the same absolute power, would eventually learn to use it in the same ways. What the story of Livia and Caligula reveals is something that extends far beyond ancient Rome. It shows that civilization is thinner than we want to believe. The marble palaces, the written laws, the hierarchy of authority, all of these can be rendered meaningless by a single person given unchecked power and the willingness to use it. Caligula did not create something new. He revealed something that was always possible within the system itself. The palace still stands. Tourists walk through the Palatine ruins, marveling at the engineering, the beauty of the preserved frescoes. They do not know as they walk what the architecture was designed to enable. They do not know that they are walking over the spaces where human minds were systematically broken. The stone remembers, but stone does not speak. Here is what we must recognize. Power without accountability always produces cruelty. Not eventually, immediately. Not in the form of grand villainies, but in the quiet, systematic destruction of those who cannot escape it. We look back at Caligula and see madness. We should see, instead, the logical conclusion of unchecked authority. A sane man, given absolute power and no restraint, will do exactly what he did. The only variable is how quickly he understands what is possible. Livia was 17 when she entered the palace. By the time Caligula died, she was barely recognizable to herself. The system had worked exactly as designed. And the worst part, the part that should keep us awake at night, is that it was not inevitable. It was not born from individual pathology. It was the product of a system that had given one person absolute dominion with no oversight, no consequences. The Palatine Palace is still there. And the architecture of absolute power in various forms is still with us. The question is not whether it will happen again. The question is whether we will recognize it when it does.